All right, it's 11:30. Should we get this started? So I'm very informal in these panels. If you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand at any time, and maybe I will get to you, and if not, I apologize.
Is there such a thing as a game that is both counterfeit and a reproduction?
We'll get to that. Not really. So I've been doing reproductions for almost 10 years now. I've been in it for quite a long time by reproduction standards. And we've noticed more and more people who get into it, sometimes they might get a little low on money and they do things they shouldn't do, you know. And when I say things they shouldn't do, I mean they're making Earthbound and passing it off as legitimate. So we're gonna, try to tell you how to spot things so you don't get ripped off there. But what do I mean when I say counterfeits or bootlegs? You've probably all read this because it's been up for like 10 minutes. But counterfeits or bootlegs are different from repros and reproductions. And how they're different is when we say repros, reproductions, we mean derivative works like if you take Final Fantasy V, which was a Japanese-only release, and you translate it into English, nobody's going to get that confused with a legitimate US Final Fantasy V because it doesn't exist. Games that are fan hacks that have very large changes like new level design and things like that, those are repros too. Counterfeits or bootlegs, they're the ones where they're trying to pass it off as a legitimate game and, clearly isn't. Also, you'll see a lot of games that are in colored shells, which we would also classify that as a counterfeit or a bootleg if it is the same ROM on it as the North American version. Okay. So the problem with them, we're all collectors, I assume, right? So the problem with them is there's a couple. One, hopefully you're not paying, top dollar for something that is not legitimate. So when you go and you try to trade it in or you try to, sell it to your friend, you don't want to take a loss. So it's really important that you know what you're getting into. The other thing is it makes it very hard on stores because stores can take in a copy that, that isn't legitimate and they'll have it right next to a legitimate copy and, one is worth $200 and the other is worth $30 and it starts bringing prices down and it's tough for stores who are paying, much more in trade. Save games. So with cart games, they use a diode on a circuit so it keeps the battery from running at all times. Most of the Chinese reproductions don't do that, and that's why you'll see a lot of the Pokemons coming out of China that don't save. You'll see that a lot with Super Nintendo games and Nintendo games as much, but Pokemon is the big one. And they use substandard parts in manufacturing. Nintendo, as everybody knows, has crazy, crazy high standards. And there are a lot of different options when you're buying chips and stuff on huge scale. And you generally want to get chips that fit the spec, but a lot of times there's a cheaper product that will work for a while, but it will just be out of spec, like it'll draw too much current or it won't draw, as much current as they designed it for, and it can cause problems down the line. I've seen a lot that are really badly soldered. So they'll work for a little while, and then all of a sudden, they'll have a cold solder joint, if anybody knows what that is. Basically, it doesn't conduct what it should. And then your game doesn't work. So that's a problem. And where do they come from? We used to be worried just about China and Hong Kong. I would say USA is almost equal now. So yeah, pretty much anywhere. Online, we all know we got to be real careful with eBay. They've started popping up on Amazon, and Etsy is the big one. Almost every Earthbound, Hagane, Aero Fighters, almost every one on Etsy is going to be, made by some guy in Minnesota or something. So be very, very careful when you're online. And you also have to look out in stores these days because this is a relatively new thing, and a lot of stores don't know exactly what to look for.
Chris, will you pull the microphone toward you a little bit?
Yes, sir. Better? All right. So as I said, many stores don't know what to look for since it's, like I said, relatively new. And it used to be really, really easy to spot these. And as the years have gone by, the bootleggers have gotten a little more crafty. There's always still a tell, but it used to be super easy. You know, they'd have like a really stretched graphic. You've probably seen Mega Man's on the Game Boy Advance that just look terrible. Usually they're better now. GameStop is the biggest problem with online stuff because they don't check or they don't care. Either one, take your pick. I know Pat the NES Punk has done numerous videos where he's pointed out a buyer who has bought a Chrono Trigger or an Earthbound, opened it up, and it's just complete phony. So, unfortunately with GameStop, they use a... Closer? Closer still? All right. We better now? Okay. GameStop and most online stores, they'll just use a stock photo and won't show you actually what you're getting, so it's harder to see what you're getting. If you buy a high dollar value game from GameStop, you should probably open it up and check it. Best Buy, Walmart, they're fine because clearly they only sell new stuff. Common fakes, Pokemons. Jesus Christ. There's probably more fake Pokemons than real Pokemons. High value NES games, Little Samson, Dinosaur Peak, Stadium Events, DuckTales 2, Bubble Bobble 2. Most of you probably know the titles that are, I'd say anything on the NES that's more than $75 has a chance of it. And you'll even see some cheaper stuff like Shatterhand is starting to become popular among bootleggers. SNES games, oh man. We used to only worry about Earthbound and Chrono Trigger. And now it's, I'd say anything $35 and up people are doing. So we see Contra 3s, Ninja Turtles 4. We were walking around earlier this morning looking at vendors, and most of them are pretty good. They know what to look for. But we did find about half a dozen. So they've all been very cool about it. They've all been like, okay, yeah, pull it. But we did find a Contra 3 and we did find a Ninja Turtles, surprisingly enough. Genesis games, you don't have to worry about too many of them. There's Crusader of Senti. Soleil also falls under it because that's just the Japanese version of Crusader of Senti. A lot of times they'll just put on the English patch. Splatterhouse 3 is a big one. We found one of those at our Cowlitz charity show last year that unfortunately a customer had bought, and he was showing it to some friends of mine, and I just happened to be there, and it's probably sitting where you're sitting in that in the Zelda hat there. And I could spot it from that far away, so it was not good. Luckily, the seller didn't know and just gave the guy his money back, so it's cool. And we find that that's what happens most of the time. When you're bringing thousands and thousands of items, you don't have time to look through every one. So we understand when something like that gets passed. Most Genesis games, the ones that come out of China, are in Mega Drive cases. Does everybody know what a Mega Drive game looks like? So they're kind of the same form factor as a Genesis cart. They're very close to the same size, but they have a notch in the side, and they're more rounded. Like, you're not going to confuse it with a Genesis cart. But if you see, say, a Ghostbusters in one of those cases or something similar to that, you got to be real careful that you know exactly what you're getting into, that it is a legitimate one and not something that somebody in China put together.
So is that a Japanese, European, or both?
It's both. I find that they're usually using the Japanese shells. I think that's what the molds are based off of. Because the Chinese sellers, they have their own molds. They don't use, they don't go out to the show floor or buy a cart and then replace the guts. They have their own molds. And I haven't seen that they have started with actual Genesis molds yet, just the Mega Drive ones. That's not saying that they won't, because they will, but they haven't caught on to that yet. We're all really here to talk about how to identify them, right? And there are a number of ways, and it's different for every system under the sun. What I look for first is the label, and there's a couple telltales on almost everything. One is you're looking at the corners. on Genesis, Super Nintendo, Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, almost every console, they all have rounded corners at a specific radius. The really, really cheap bootlegs, they have square corners, and that's really, really easy to spot. The other thing you're looking for on the label is the level of specular highlights. And what that is the level of reflection from light going to it. What I like to do is I will take it and, I'll kind of shine it to the light and see how much is reflecting. Once you get a hang of it, you know what a legitimate game looks like, and you know what a reproduction or a bootleg laminate will look like. A lot of times the colors are off. A lot of times the markings, like on NES and SNES, they all have a little code. On NES, I believe it's always in the upper right-hand corner. It'll say NES-something-something-USA. You want to look for that. You want to look for the seal of quality. Seal of quality on legitimates kind of almost looks like foil. It's a little shiny. That's really hard to reproduce with a printer. So it's a dead giveaway if you find one that's just completely flat. You're also looking for oval seal of quality versus circle seal of quality, because a lot of times they will just put the same seal on every game. And of course that requires you to know which game has which, but a quick search online will tell you that. On Game Boy Advance, every Game Boy Advance game is actually stamped with a 2-letter or number code. And it's really faint. Usually you'll have to hold it up to the light to reflect it, but you'll see a clear stamp, and at least the people coming out of China, they have not figured out that you need to do that if you want to pass it off. So label is your first indicator, and it's still, I think it's the best indicator. I have seen a few, especially the ones coming out of Hong Kong and China, that are starting to use die cutters, so you cannot always rely on the corners. But if you see square corners, pretty good chance that it's not right. There are exceptions, such as some of the acclaimed games on Nintendo, like Wizards and Warriors 3 comes to mind, where they made their own labels, and they look terrible, terrible, terrible. I was fooled by the first one I saw years ago, and I said, look at this is completely substandard. Opened it up, no, it's legit. That's just how they all are. So
if you see a good one, that's suspect.
That's something I was going to touch on. A lot of times the labels will be too good. And you have to keep in mind the technology of the time and how they're printing it. They're using screen printing, or sometimes they'll use, I'm sorry, I can't remember what it's called, but a dot printing method where you'll see a bunch of teeny tiny dots in it. Not quite dot matrix, but you almost have to use a jeweler's loop, honestly. But if you look real close, you'll see that they've got a bunch of tiny dots, and that's really hard to reproduce with new printers because new printers are, frankly, too good.
On some of the used titles, I should look at the cartridge's overall wear and tear on it, because if it's like a scary mint condition one, that's a red flag in my books.
A lot of them have gotten wise to that, and they will scratch them. Yeah, that's something new that I've only seen in maybe the past year. But yeah, that used to be dead giveaway every time. But yeah, now they'll scratch them. Again, you'll see the laminate won't be quite right, though. Plastic quality, Chinese plastic that they're putting out nowadays feels a little different. It's hard to describe, but if you hold one in your hands, you'll know. We all know what the legitimate carts feel like. If you hold it and it just feels a little off, just check it. It's no big deal. Every seller that I've ever run into is fine with having you check something, because they don't want to sell you junk either. Pins. This is how we found one earlier today. The label looked perfect, and the pins on NES and SNES, everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say pins, right? Okay. So they're a rectangle, and then they've got a tiny little finger on the end of them. As far as I have seen, none of the Chinese or Hong Kong manufacturers do that. They all have just a perfectly straight, perfectly rectangle pin. So that's a giveaway on if it is a newly manufactured one. Of course, that doesn't help us if somebody has taken a board and replaced the ROM on it, because it's a legitimate board. But most of the ones we see are coming out of China and Hong Kong. So it's pretty rare when you see one that has the little tiny finger on the pin and is not legitimate. But like I said, we found one earlier today by looking at pins. PCB markings and layout. A couple months ago, a guy brought me a earthbound prototype to authenticate, an NES earthbound prototype. I'm sure we all know how uncommon those are. And usually when I'm authenticating something, I bring up an image of a known board, and I'll see where the vias, they're like the little dots of solder basically. I'll see where those are, and I'll see where the markings are. There's some variations, and you know, you'll just compare them. But this board was unlike any other prototype board that I could find online. Completely different when it came to the silkscreen marking. Silkscreen is, of course, the white lettering that says Nintendo or Sega or whatever on it. But I looked into it, and every little via was in the exact right spot. Every trace was exactly the same, and on the back, they actually had it etched out in the copper on the board what different jumpers on the board did. And it was such a crazy level of detail that, yes, you could fake it, but nobody would. I mean, it would take years to fake it as exact as that was. And then we found out who it came from, and it came from somebody at HAL Laboratories. So that made it real easy to say this is legitimate. So the seller, you have to keep in mind who you're buying it from. As we said, online, eBay. If you see somebody who's got, 5 Haganes, it's a pretty good bet they're not all legitimate. Really, really obvious stuff like that, should throw a red flag, because nobody's hoarding just hundreds and hundreds of copies. And then if you see somebody who's got only high-end stuff, who only has Hagane, Aero Fighters, Bubble Bobble 2, all the high dollar stuff, if they only have that, that's a little suspicious, because collectors, sellers, they have everything. And EPROM, EEPROM, and PROM, does anybody know what those 3 things are? All right, let's take these 2 right here.
Okay, so an EPROM is an electronically programmable read-only memory chip, which means that it's a ROM chip, but you can actually send electrical signals to set its data, as opposed to physically burning it like you would with an actual ROM chip.
Wow, that's pretty good.
An EEPROM, or does somebody else want to?
Sure, go ahead. Wow, okay, so people know way too much.
The difference between EPROM and double EPROM is an EPROM is you use UV light to erase it. Double EPROM, you can erase it by writing to the ROM, electrically.
I just grabbed the wrong chip.
Well, that's actually the answer we're looking for. An EPROM, single E, has a quartz window on it. Legitimate produced games don't have that because they're far, far more expensive than buying a PROM. So if you see anything with a quartz window, it's either been repaired, it's a test card, a prototype, something weird like that, or most likely it's not legitimate. An EEPROM looks very similar to a PROM, where it's just a flat black piece of plastic. And those, like this gentleman said, are electronically erasable, so they don't have the little window. But what they do have is they will have a marking that says what kind of chip it is. On NES, it'll be usually 28F010 or 28F020, something like that, some identifier that you could actually look up and you'll find those chips for sale. PROMs are one-time programmable, so they're very cheap to buy when you buy a ton of them. You put them in what's called a PROM blower, and it blows a bunch of internal fuses inside, basically, and that's why it's one-time programmable. That's what all these games use. And for the most part, they'll say Sega or NES or, some indicator of the manufacturer right on the chip. They don't always, but usually they do. The other dead giveaway between an EEPROM and a PROM, at least when it comes to Super Nintendo and NES, is the presence of wires or a daughter board. Nintendo are jerks, and they like to do things in a very non-standard way. So there's a standard with chips called the JDEC standards, and it basically says which pin is which, and they're all supposed to adhere to that, or adhere pretty closely to that. Nintendo said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to make our own, basically. So their pins, when they get to 64K and up, I believe, are wired slightly differently, and that's why on these repros you'll see wires to jumper them to the right vias. On SNES, you will see daughter boards because SNES, despite being a 16-bit system, used an 8-bit memory bus in the cartridges. A lot of times they used 4 megabyte chips, and finding a 4 megabyte chip that is 8-bit and not 16-bit these days is impossible. I've actually never even seen one for sale. I know they exist, but I've never seen one for sale. And again, of course, because Nintendo has to be special, they wired it differently. So you'll see a little daughter board. It's very, very, very easy to spot. Of course, PROMs don't have any of that.
So we can kind of thank Nintendo for being such jerks that it makes it at least a slight bit easier for us to figure things out.
Well, my main business is making reproductions, so I don't thank them for anything. They make it way harder than Genesis, where you just drop it in and there's no rewiring.
My guess is that's exactly why they did it.
An anti-piracy measure.
Probably.
There's theories. Some people say that yes, it was anti-piracy, and I don't know about that because it's pretty easy to reverse engineer which chip goes to which. How they did it was they just found a pin out of the pin connector and traced it out. So I think why they did it was to simplify the board layout. But who knows? We'd have to ask Howard Lincoln. Is he here this year? No? No.
Are you sure he was involved in the decision?
I'm sure he was not involved in the decision. Tools needed, game bits, of course. You can get them on eBay, you can get them on Amazon. They're really cheap. Usually they're bits like these silver things. Sometimes they're a full screwdriver. 4.5 millimeter, I got this backwards actually. 4.5 millimeter for Genesis and 3.8 millimeter for NES and SNES. And for Game Boy Advance, you're going to need the tri-wing driver. There's numerous tri-wing drivers, so get one with that kind of tip on it.
Isn't it also a game bit for the Game Boy as well?
The Game Boy one uses the same one as the NES. So, okay. So here we go with our game of is it real or fake? This is a softball one. So if you can't spot this, you're kind of in trouble.
Look at it's fake. Look at the bits at the bottom. They're plastic. It should be metal.
Yep, they should be metal. A lot of the cases, well, older molds in China use these plastic screws and the case just snaps together. So if you see anything with plastic screws, it's 100% fake. I've also seen a couple where, like I said, they're getting a little craftier. They'll take these old molds and they will drill out the plastic screw and they'll put in a metal screw and they'll just glue it in. Because the whole case snaps together, there's no threads. So they'll just glue the metal screws on. It's ridiculous. All right, which one? One of them's real and one of them's fake.
The one on the left is fake.
Why is the one on the left fake?
Because my vision is terrible.
I think the one on the left is real.
The colors of the one on the right seem off.
It's not a trick question, I promise.
It's a seal of quality, right?
you my answer.
You're going to the one on the right? Are we at a consensus?
Wait,
We'll take a vote here. We'll take a vote. Who thinks the left one is fake? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You look a little unsure. 7. Well, now I can't count that high because people are putting them up and down. Okay. Who thinks the right's fake? You're going to be disappointed. The right one is real, and the left one is the fake. So, the corner, that's dead giveaway. You can see how on the right it's perfect. It's perfectly cut, like a die cut. And on the left, I mean, I don't know if you can see it from that far away, but it's just not perfect. Somebody did it with scissors. You can also look at the Nintendo logo. It's very blurry on the one on the left, and it's sharper on the one on the right.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
What was that? I heard something back there.
The font for the code on the bottom, the one that says USA on it, is different between the two.
Yep. Fonts are a good way to tell.
And it's the same font as the kids' 2 adults as well.
And also,
And-
and also on the top blue section, there's actually a little red section on the right hand side, and then on the blue side it's
Mhm.
there.
Yeah, it's cropped a tiny bit, but it is cropped. The other thing that I noticed in my quick look through is the purple triangle. So again, I don't know if it's showing up on there, but the purple triangle on the left has a white outline, and they should not. It's also too big. The purple triangle on the legitimate one, the top right corner kind of ends right where the second N begins, and the other one goes further.
What does the purple triangle mean?
I don't know. Just Nintendo put it there. Nobody knows why.
Nice way the pins are, right?
Yeah, let's go with that.
Maybe it tells you which way to insert it, or maybe it points to the seal of quality.
It's for those very special kids who tried to put it upside down. So yeah, there's a number of things just on that label. You can also kind of see that the reflection is different. The reflection in the light, it's a little shinier on the one on the right. But the story with this, I got this picture offline, and it was somebody who bought it off of eBay, brand new. And as you can see, they scuffed up the label a little bit on the fake one. So from an eBay picture, probably pretty hard to tell until, the guy gets it and he's like, it doesn't quite look right. Okay, real SNES PCB, they're all pretty similar to that. Some of them will have 2 chips, some of them have 1 chip, a lot of them don't have a battery, and if they have special hardware like the Super FX carts or something like that, they'll also look different. But that's just your basic SNES PCB. In fact, I believe that's could be an Earthbound, could be a Chrono Trigger. They all kind of use the same PCB. That one's fake. Yeah. As he said right there, there's a glop top, which is basically black epoxy over a very cheap chip that doesn't have a casing. Nintendo very, very rarely did that. They did that in a lot of re-releases of the black box games, and they did it in some very late releases of Star Fox. They did it in Star Fox Weekend Competition Cart, whatever, something like that.
I found one inside a Mario Brothers Knockout cartridge.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That they produce like thousands of those in their.
Yeah. Anything that the Nintendo stuff that they re-released, a lot of times that has glop tops. But as he said, it's a pretty good indicator. And as you can see, the board layout is really, really, really different. I could point out what all those chips are, but nobody cares, so we're not going to do that. Also, oh, good for you. Look it up on yourself. Look it up on your own time. So, you can see the pins on it don't have that little finger that I was talking about. They're perfectly straight, even at the edge. It's a little hard to see, or the image, but we'll use what we got. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I do not have any bootleg PCBs at my place, so I couldn't bring any in. These are the ones that are coming out of China these days. almost all of them look like that. Some of them will also have a chip on the back, whereas Nintendo PCBs never have a chip on the back. I'm trying to think of an exception. I can't think of one. All right, little Samson fake, what do we see?
5 screws.
So other people have watched Pat the NES Punk's video on this, I see. Yeah, 5 screws, it's a dead giveaway. Little Samson came out in, 94, 95, somewhere around there. Way after they stopped using 5 screws. Now, that isn't to say that it's impossible, because I've seen some very odd 5 screws. I found a Castlevania 2, which was only produced in 3 screw, but it was 5 screw, and it was completely legitimate. Buddy who's a huge Castlevania collector actually found it, and he paid handsomely. So there are variations, but on something like Little Samson that had a very small production run, yeah, it's not going to happen. And take a good look at the label before I go to the next slide. You got it. You saw how the contrast is just way off. People a lot of times try to fix the labels to make them look a little nicer. So it's a dead giveaway. Again, you have to know what you're looking at, and you have to compare it with a number of pictures, unless it's something stupid like they use a 5-screw case. That makes it really easy.
What about cue cards?
Hue cards for TG16? You know, I'll be honest, I don't know a whole lot about the reproductions of those. I've seen a couple, notably Magical Chase, of course. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know a whole lot about them. I believe that they're different in some way, like they say reproduction or something like that. If I find one, I'll let people know on my site. And Magical Chase is the only one that I've seen. I have seen a lot of CDs, though. A lot of PC Engine and TG16 CDs. They are made by a company in Germany called PC Engine Works. And they are so close to the legitimate ones that I ran a test. I brought in 5 people, and I lined them up, legitimates and fakes. And I said, all right, point out the fakes, point out the legitimates, and nobody got them all right. The tells on those are, I believe all of them say PCE Works on it. They have a little extra logo. Now, it looks legitimate, but it isn't. And they're actually stamped CDs, so, you know, usually you'd look at the back and it would be pale green or some color, pale purple. But these are actual stamped with aluminum, so they look perfect. So be very careful. Always look for the PCE Works. Some of them have minor label variations, but we don't, at least I don't come across a lot of Turbo CD stuff, so I'm not an expert on which label is which across different regions. But yeah, look for PCE Works. Remember what I said about wires? That's I believe that's a TS-ROM board, like anybody cares. Again, these are EPROMs, single E. They've used the stickers to cover up the windows. A lot of people do that because you erase them by exposing them to light for a long time or a certain wavelength of light. And you're supposed to put stickers on them so they don't erase themselves. Obviously, those wires are to rewire the pins so that it works. And if you see anything that's wired, it's not legitimate. Okay, so I said the labels on Game Boy Advance have the little stamp. That was the best picture I could find of one. Thank you, retrocket.net. Ooh, that's hard to say. You can see the stamp in the 9B or 9.5, whatever it says, and E4. It's also a real one. What they're pointing out is the silk screen, 2002 Nintendo. Take a good look at the layout of the board. You don't see any glob tops. Yeah, I've always thought it was bizarre that the battery goes over, but it's legitimate. That's how they do it. Fakes. All right. what pokes out to you, because there's a number of things on both of them. Let's start with the fire red and the board. What doesn't look right? Glob top, yep. What is that?
No battery.
Right, no battery.
Nintendo logo just doesn't look right on the silkscreen.
And as you can see, it's circle I, which I don't know what standard that is, but it's not the circle C that you want to see for copyright.
And also the ESRB rating is a little bit different.
The pins, see how they have holes in them? Revias, that's somebody wasn't paying attention when they designed that PCB.
It doesn't use a battery when the real one does. It's all-
Yeah, there might be, I believe the battery might be under that glop top. No, that doesn't make sense. In fact, I don't know how they're doing it in that one. It might just be one that doesn't save, because a lot of them don't. A lot of them, they're just like, we're not gonna put a battery in, you start it up, it works fine, and that's all they need. The other thing is, that looks like a EEPROM or a PROM, but it has a sticker on it. And Nintendo never put stickers on them. So if you see that, obvious. The chip in the upper right-hand corner of that one, you see how it looks wet? It's flux from when they soldered it. And Nintendo is very, very strict in their manufacturing. They don't let anything like that through. But when you're hand soldering, it gets all over the place. And as you can see, the label doesn't have the stamp. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah.
2 people, okay, go ahead.
So my first question is, so for the fire red right there,
Mhm.
is it possible that the reason why it doesn't have a battery is probably because it's using some sort of flash memory to store the save data?
Yeah, some non-volatile flash memory.
Yeah.
It's possible, but without, being able to see the chips, I can't say yes or no.
So you can say we probably just look out for that too.
Yes, you can. On Game Boy Advance, at least.
I
And,
just wanted to mention with GBA cards, you can actually see the Nintendo logo on the board without having to take the card apart.
right,
You just like take a flash picture of under your regular connectors are, you can usually see that.
Right.
And if you got that in the factory test numbers, you're probably good.
If it's
It's a good rule of thumb there.
One of the GBA Pokemon games, and it doesn't have the battery, even if it saves the flash, you won't get the clock.
oh, really?
Because the clock is,
Oh, yeah, they don't have that oscillator on there that they had in the other
It's
one.
powered by the battery on the cartridge, and it's infamous for dying. In fact, it'll continue to save after the battery's dead. So I suspect they're going to use some sort of non-volatile memory for your save, but the battery is only for the,
For the clock.
yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're here, because I did not actually know that. Oh, yes, sorry.
I was just gonna point out, because like a lot of GBA games, like the Zeldas, they don't have clocks, so they don't have batteries, because I think they started using flash.
Later on, yeah, they did. Like Minish Cap, I believe, started with that. Might be Minish Cap that started, but yeah, you're correct. Those, you have to use the other methods, like looking at the label, like you said back there, looking for the silk screen on it. As you can see, the Emerald version there doesn't have the silk screen, so I mean, right there you know it's fake. And as he mentioned, you can see that if you just chip open the cart. And that used to be the way that we found Game Boy Advance fakes. It used to be they weren't silk screened, and now most of them are. How are we doing on time here? We got plenty of time. We got like 20 minutes and I'm out of slides. So, who's got questions and comments? We'll go way back there first.
Yeah, what's your opinion on people reprinting labels on their own personal collection of games? Like somebody's got a Chrono Trigger with bad label, they bought it for cheap, and then they relabeled it. Do you think that people should be doing that? Because eventually it might re-enter the market and, or, just kind of a concrete
Right.
on whether the reproduction of the label lessens the value of the game compared to a game that has the original label that's been changed.
That's a great question. There were a couple carts on the floor that I found that were repro label. They marked them. They put another sticker on it that said repro label, which we were very appreciative. And we did have them open the carts just to make sure that they were legitimate. they're out there. I think most people are going to tell you that it's a reproduction label, but honestly, if it's for your own personal collection, I don't see a problem with it. The problem is, like you said, if it re-enters the market. You know, I would like everybody to be completely forthcoming. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and then you have to look to general quality, corners, you know, all the stuff that we mentioned. So, I mean, some people say that's okay, and some people say that it isn't. I'm fine with it as long as it's for your own collection and, you know, nobody else buys it.
Yeah, do you have any advice about looking out for a DS cart repros, Nintendo DS?
Wow, that's a good one. They are really, really good at copying them.
Yeah. The best I've seen is that usually the repros won't work if you put it in a 3DS or a later DSi.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I know some of them do. I know a lot of the earlier DS ones didn't because they changed something in the authentication.
Other than that, it's just the basics, it's the label, machine.
Yeah.
Don't buy from China.
Right. Don't buy from China is really what it comes down to. The best way I can tell for a DS is to look at the Nintendo oval on the back of the cart. We have to remember that Chinese manufacturing is generally as cheap as can be to get it done and get it working. So the Nintendo logo, it will be slightly off. It might be a little jagged. It might be deeper recessed than it's supposed to be. Like I said, with DS, it's really difficult. Again, we used to look for the silk screen, but they've caught on to that. So, yeah, be careful. See you back there.
So, when you talked about where a lot of counterfeits are made, you know, used to be China, now it's kind of everywhere. Generally, where do you go for those official hardware that stuff come from?
Where do you think it comes from?
Yeah, my first thought was China, but I really don't know because I know like
Yeah.
design and production, design and stuff like that could be in one place for like development, but then like production-wise, I always assumed that was somewhere else, like, you know.
Yeah, production is China.
Okay.
But they'll be generally different factories, so they'll have variations. Yeah. You know, again, Nintendo is super, super strict. So if they find a factory giving out molds or something, they're cut. And those Chinese factories know that, and they know they're a huge buyer. So there might be some backdoor deals, but I don't think there's really that many where they're sharing molds and things like that. But yeah, good question. They are coming out of China.
Super Nintendo carts usually either made in Japan or made in Mexico.
Super Nintendo carts, yeah, well, again, she was asking about newer stuff, I think, like DS, Game Boy Advance. You know, no Chinese manufacturer on a Super Nintendo cart is going to say made in China. That's really, really dumb. Yeah, right. And it's good that you actually mentioned the Japan versus Mexico labels. Remember, we were talking about the different levels of gloss. The ones made in Mexico are paper labels, so they don't have a glossy laminate.
Yeah, it threw me for a loop when I got a copy of Chrono Trigger and it said it was from Mexico and had the real label. But
Yeah, it just doesn't quite look right, but that's how it is. Earthbound is the same way on some of them. A lot of titles. Anything re-released. Anybody else? Oh, yes, one more.
I guess you never really talked about like CD-based stuff.
Mhm.
Is it pretty obvious to tell? Like, I mean, PlayStation's easy because it's black, but like other.
PlayStation is hard because it's black, because you can get black CDRs.
Oh,
Yeah, I've had them for a number of years because I like them.
But they usually won't work because it's a very special CD on the PlayStation.
Right. They have, just like,
It was a burner that was really responsible for.
No, the
Just-
CD itself has like weird patterns.
Mhm.
So if the PlayStation doesn't find that, it won't run the disc.
just like the Saturn, they had an unreadable pattern, basically. And a CD burner, at least consumer CD burners, cannot replicate that. So this guy is giving me that signal. So yeah, that's what you look for. It either won't run or, you know, it'll be very obviously a CDR in the color, unless, like I said, it's the PC Engine work stuff. All right. We're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much. You're very welcome.